The Godfather is one of the most celebrated films ever made. Don Corleone sitting behind his desk, dispensing justice, commanding loyalty, building something that looked almost noble from the right angle. Hollywood gave organized crime a face that audiences could respect, even admire. But the man that story was actually built on was nothing like that portrait. Charles Lucky Luciano was a 9-year-old Sicilian immigrant who was running extortion rackets before he was old enough to finish elementary school. He sold narcotics as a teenager, had his throat cut, and was left for dead on a beach in his 30s, eliminated 2 bosses in the same year, built a criminal governing structure that outlasted him by decades, cut a deal with the United States military from inside a prison cell, and passed away at an airport with an arrest warrant waiting to be served. Today we are covering the real Lucky Luciano story. What you are about to hear is worse than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. Section 1. The Boy from Lercara Fridi. The Making of a Monster. Salvatore Lucania was born on November 24, 1897, in a small Sicilian town called Lercara Fridi. His father worked in the sulfur mines. Back-breaking, dangerous work that paid almost nothing. The family lived in poverty, surrounded by other families living the exact same way. There was no real future there, and his father knew it. So, like hundreds of thousands of other Italians in that era, the Lucania family packed what little they had and made the journey to America. In 1906, when Salvatore was 9 years old, the family landed in New York City and settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It was one of the most densely packed neighborhoods in the entire country. Italians, Jews, Irish, all crammed into the same tenements, sharing the same cramped streets, all chasing the same idea that America was supposed to be different. For most of them, it was just a different kind of hard. Salvatore did not adjust well. He could not speak English. School made no sense to him. He was small, foreign, and easy to ignore. Until he figured out that being feared was a faster path to respect than anything a classroom could offer. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already running a small protection racket on his own block. He charged other kids a few cents a week to make sure nobody bothered them on the way to school. If they refused to pay, he became the one bothering them. It was a simple system, and it worked. It was during this time that he crossed paths with a younger Jewish kid named Meyer Lansky. The story goes that Luciano tried to shake Lansky down for protection money. Lansky refused. He did not run, did not cry, did not beg. He just stood there and said no. Luciano was so impressed by the kid's nerve that instead of following through on his threat, he struck up a friendship. That friendship would shape American organized crime for the next 50 years. By 1914, Salvatore had dropped out of school entirely. He found work as a delivery boy for a hat company, which gave him something useful: access. He started hiding heroin inside the hat bands of the hats he delivered. It was a small operation, but it was his first real taste of the narcotics business, and it showed an instinct for concealment and logistics that would define his entire career. In 1916, undercover agents caught him. He was 18 years old. On June 25, 1916, he pleaded guilty to narcotics possession and was sentenced to 6 months at Hampton Farms Penitentiary. That 6 months was the only time Salvatore Lucania would spend behind bars for the next 2 decades. From 1916 to 1936, he was arrested 25 times on charges ranging from assault to illegal gambling to robbery. Not once did any of those arrests result in a conviction. He slipped through the legal system over and over again, which is part of how he eventually earned the name the world would come to know him by. The press, the police, and eventually everyone else started calling him Lucky. After his release from Hampton Farms, he made one personal change that stuck. He decided the name Salvatore sounded too foreign, too soft. He started going by Charles Luciano. Later, the newspapers would further drift from his actual surname of Lucania to Luciano, partly through persistent misspelling, and the name just stayed. The Lower East Side in the years after World War I was a place where a young man with no education and no legal prospects had a clear set of options. Lucky chose the ones that paid. He deepened his connection with Meyer Lansky and began running with a tight circle of young men who would all go on to reshape American crime. Lansky, Benjamin Siegel, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese. These were not career criminals yet. They were teenagers and young adults from immigrant families who had looked at what legitimate America was offering people like them and decided it was not enough. Lucky was sharper than most of the people around him. He had a natural instinct for organization and for reading people. He understood early that the biggest weakness in criminal operations was internal fighting, that gangs wasted more energy destroying each other than building anything. He filed that observation away. It would become the foundation of everything he built later. By the early 1920s, he was making real money. Prohibition had just begun, and the entire country had essentially handed organized crime a business opportunity that could not have been designed better if someone had tried. A case of liquor that cost $25 could sell for $1,000. Lucky recognized it immediately for what it was. Not a crime wave, but a market. And he was already positioning himself to dominate it. The boy from Lercara Fridi, who could not speak English at age 9 and was running extortion by age 10, was now in his mid-20s, making millions, moving through Manhattan's social circles in expensive suits, and building relationships with politicians, police, and power brokers that most legitimate businessmen could not access. He had figured out something that would take law enforcement decades to fully understand. That organized crime at his level was not really about violence. Violence was just a tool. What it was really about was structure, loyalty, and money. But before Lucky could build the empire he had in his head, he would first have to survive something that was meant to leave him in the ground. In 1929, someone decided that Lucky Luciano needed to disappear, and they came very close to making it happen. Section 2. Prohibition made him. The Bootlegging Empire and Arnold Rothstein's influence. On January 17, 1920, the United States government made one of the most consequential mistakes in its history. The 18th Amendment took effect, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol across the entire country. The people who wrote that law believed they were cleaning up America. What they actually did was hand organized crime the single greatest financial opportunity it had ever seen. Lucky Luciano saw it immediately for what it was. A case of liquor that cost $25 on the legal market could be sold for $1,000 on the street. Speakeasies, illegal bars operating behind closed doors, multiplied across New York City at a rate that law enforcement could not keep up with. By the peak of Prohibition, there were an estimated 32,000 of them in New York alone. Every single one of them needed a supplier. Lucky intended to be that supplier. But before he could fully step into that world, he needed a teacher. He found one in Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein was unlike anyone else Lucky had encountered up to that point. He was not a street thug. He was a businessman who happened to operate outside the law. He wore suits, kept a clean public image, moved through the highest social circles in New York, and understood that the real money in crime was not in pulling jobs. It was in financing them, organizing them, and staying several layers removed from anything that could get you arrested. Rothstein had already fixed the 1919 World Series, which told you everything you needed to know about how he thought. He did not play the game. He controlled who won. Rothstein took Lucky under his wing and essentially rebuilt him. He took him shopping at Wanamaker's department store in Manhattan and showed him how to dress. He explained how to conduct himself in rooms full of politicians and judges. He introduced him to the concept of running bootleg alcohol not as a series of individual heists, but as a fully structured supply chain. Ships anchored offshore dispensing liquor to smaller boats, which carried it to warehouses, which distributed it to retail outlets. It was logistics. It was a business model. And for the first time, Lucky had a framework for the scale of operation he had always wanted to build. Working alongside Lansky and Costello, Lucky started his own bootlegging operation with financing from Rothstein. He was also simultaneously working for Joe Masseria, one of the most powerful mob bosses in New York at the time, as a gunman and lieutenant. Lucky was moving in multiple worlds at once and collecting intelligence from all of them. By 1925, he was grossing over $12 million per year and keeping roughly $4 million of that as personal income, all from illegal gambling and bootlegging operations that stretched from New York into Philadelphia. He moved into the Barbizon Plaza Hotel, where he lived under the alias Charles Lane. He dressed like a wealthy businessman because he was one. The difference between Lucky and the men who ran legitimate corporations was simply that his industry operated in the dark. In 1923, he had a close call that taught him an important lesson. He was caught in a sting operation while selling narcotics. He avoided prison time on that occasion, but being publicly identified as a drug dealer damaged his carefully constructed image among the politicians, police officials, and high society contacts he had been cultivating. His response was instructive. He bought 200 expensive ringside seats to the Jack Dempsey and Luis Firpo boxing match in the Bronx and distributed them to top figures from the criminal world, politics, and law enforcement. Rothstein took him on another shopping trip beforehand to make sure he looked the part. The strategy worked. His reputation recovered. What that incident revealed was something fundamental about how Lucky's mind operated. He did not panic under pressure. He assessed the damage, identified what needed to be repaired, and spent money strategically to fix it. That was not the thinking of a street criminal. That was the thinking of someone who understood public relations before the term even existed. Rothstein was shot and killed in November 1928 during a poker game dispute. His death removed Lucky's most sophisticated mentor, but by that point, Lucky had absorbed what he needed. He went back to working more closely with Masseria, who had declared himself the most powerful boss in New York and was now demanding tribute payments from other criminal operations across the city. Lucky complied outwardly. Internally, he was already watching, calculating, and growing increasingly impatient with the old way of doing things. Masseria and his rival, Salvatore Maranzano, were both what the younger generation of criminals called Mustache Petes, old-world Sicilian bosses who spoke little English, refused to work with anyone who was not Italian, and ran their operations through fear and tradition rather than efficiency and profit. Lucky found both of them limiting. He had already built meaningful alliances with Jewish gangsters like Lansky and Siegel, Irish figures who controlled certain territories, and business-minded Italians like Costello, who shared his vision. The idea that you would leave money on the table because of someone's ethnicity struck Lucky as not just prejudiced, but financially stupid. By the late 1920s, he was one of the most powerful and connected criminals in the country, and he was doing it while technically serving as a lieutenant to a boss he had already mentally outgrown. The Prohibition era had given him the money, the connections, and the operational blueprint for something far larger than bootlegging. He knew what he wanted to build. The only thing standing between him and it was a pair of old men who thought they ran New York. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened to Lucky in October 1929, though, would come before any of that reckoning. Someone put him in a car, and everyone involved expected him to never come back out. Section 3. The ride he wasn't supposed to survive. The 1929 abduction. In October 1929, Lucky Luciano was 31 years old, one of the most connected and financially powerful criminals in New York, and by all appearances, completely untouchable. He had the money, the relationships, the protection. He was careful about where he went and who he trusted. None of it mattered on the night someone decided he needed to be removed permanently. The details of exactly what happened that night have never been fully confirmed because Lucky himself gave different versions of the story depending on who was asking and when. What is not disputed is what the police found afterward. A patrol officer discovered Lucky on a beach on Staten Island. He had been severely beaten. His hands had been bound. He had been stabbed multiple times and his throat had been cut. He was left there by whoever had taken him, presumably because they believed he was already gone. He was not. Lucky was taken to the hospital and survived. The physical damage was permanent. The attack left him with a drooping right eye that would stay with him for the rest of his life, the result of a severed muscle in his cheek. His face was never the same. Neither was his reputation, though not in the way his attackers intended. In the criminal world, surviving something like that did not make you look weak. It made you look like someone the universe itself could not finish off. The story of how the nickname Lucky became permanently attached to him is actually contested. Some accounts say it was Meyer Lansky who started calling him Lucky after this incident. Other versions trace the nickname to his consistent success at gambling, or simply to a long-running mispronunciation of his actual surname, Lucania, by people who could not be bothered to get it right. By 1929, the press had picked it up, and it spread from there. After surviving a throat wound that should have been a death sentence, the name stopped being a casual observation and started being something people said with genuine disbelief. When the police questioned him about what had happened, Lucky told them he had no idea who was responsible. He gave them nothing. That was not a surprise. Talking to law enforcement about who had wronged you was not how that world operated, and Lucky understood the rules better than almost anyone. But the question of who actually ordered the attack has been discussed and debated ever since. One theory is that Salvatore Maranzano, who was in the middle of his war against Joe Masseria at the time, ordered the attack to eliminate a key Masseria lieutenant and send a message. Lucky was, at least officially, working for Masseria, which would have made him a target. This theory has been repeated in various accounts of the period and is considered by many historians to be the most plausible explanation. Another theory, which Lucky himself offered in a 1953 interview, is that the police were responsible. His account was that officers had grabbed him looking for information about Jack Legs Diamond, a bootlegger and criminal figure who was active in New York at the time. In that version, the attack was an unofficial interrogation that went far too far. Lucky claimed he refused to give them anything and was left for dead as a result. A third possibility that has been raised is that the attack came from within Masseria's own circle, that someone close to the boss had decided Lucky was becoming too powerful and too independent and needed to be dealt with before he became a problem. No definitive evidence has ever established which of these versions is true. The people who could have answered the question either did not know or did not talk. What the incident did, regardless of its origin, was fundamentally change Lucky's public profile. Before October 1929, he was known inside criminal circles and to certain law enforcement officials, but he was not a household name. The attack changed that. Newspapers covered the story of the man found on a Staten Island beach with his throat cut, who had somehow lived. The coverage introduced Lucky Luciano to a much wider audience than he had previously reached, and it did so in a way that made him seem almost mythological. Inside the criminal world, the effect was equally significant. Men who had already respected Lucky now looked at him with something closer to awe. Surviving a one-way ride, which was the term used for the kind of forced drive that was supposed to end in a body being disposed of, was almost unheard of. It happened to Lucky, and he walked away from it. permanently scarred, but alive. The people who had underestimated him now had very clear evidence that doing so was a mistake. There is also an argument that the incident crystallized something in Lucky's thinking that had already been forming for years. He had watched Masseria and Maranzano wage their war across New York, costing money, lives, and stability for everyone operating in that environment. He had seen how the old world approach to power, based on dominance, tribute, and the constant threat of internal betrayal, created exactly the kind of chaos that made everyone vulnerable, including him. Being grabbed off the street and left for dead was the end result of a system that ran entirely on personal grievance and unchecked aggression. He had a different vision, and once he recovered from what had been done to him, he began moving toward it with considerably more urgency than before. The Castellamarese war between Masseria and Maranzano was still grinding on. Both men were spending resources, losing soldiers, and generating the kind of attention that was bad for every operation connected to either of them. Lucky had privately concluded that the war needed to end, that both men needed to be removed, and that he was the one who was going to do it. The only question was the timing. By 1931, that timing had arrived, and what Lucky did next was so calculated and so ruthless that it reshaped American organized crime in a matter of months. Section 4. The Double Betrayal. How Luciano eliminated two bosses and took everything. The Castellamarese War had been running since 1930, and everyone involved was exhausted by it. Joe Masseria on one side, Salvatore Maranzano on the other, and dozens of soldiers from both camps losing their lives over a power struggle that was costing everybody money and drawing exactly the kind of law enforcement attention that made running criminal operations nearly impossible. Lucky Luciano was officially in Masseria's camp. He had been one of Masseria's most trusted lieutenants for years, but by early 1931, he had already made his decision. He was going to end the war by ending both men, one after the other, and he was going to do it in a way that left him standing at the top when the smoke cleared. The plan required patience and precision. Lucky could not simply move against Masseria without a guarantee of protection from Maranzano afterward, and he could not approach Maranzano without being certain the conversation would not get back to Masseria before he was ready to act. He navigated both problems. He quietly opened a line of communication with Maranzano, the man who had been trying to destroy his boss for the past year, and struck a deal. Lucky would arrange for Masseria to be eliminated. In return, Maranzano would end the war, give Lucky control of Masseria's operation, and bring him in as his top lieutenant. Maranzano agreed. The deal was set. On April 15, 1931, Lucky invited Masseria to lunch at Nuova Villa Tamaro, a restaurant on Coney Island in Brooklyn. The two men ate together and then settled in for a card game. At some point during the game, Lucky excused himself and went to the bathroom. While he was gone, 4 men entered the restaurant. They were Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Masseria was shot and eliminated at the table. He was hit multiple times. By the time Lucky came back out, his boss of over a decade was gone. Nobody was ever convicted for the elimination of Masseria. Lucky's alibi was that he had been in the bathroom. No witnesses came forward. The case went nowhere. With Masseria out of the picture, Maranzano immediately moved to consolidate power. He called a large meeting of crime figures and declared himself capo di tutti capi, which translates to boss of all bosses. He reorganized the New York gangs into 5 distinct families, appointed bosses to lead each one, and positioned himself at the top of the entire structure. Lucky was named as one of the key lieutenants in the new arrangement, which was exactly what had been agreed. But Maranzano had not survived the Castellamarese War by being naive. He understood that Lucky Luciano was dangerous. He had watched this man engineer the removal of his own boss. The logic was obvious. If Lucky had done it to Masseria, there was no particular reason he would not eventually do it to Maranzano as well. Within months of declaring his authority, Maranzano was already planning to have Lucky removed before Lucky could move against him. Lucky found out. The specific account documented in historical records is that Thomas Lucchese, one of the other bosses in the reorganized structure, warned Lucky that Maranzano had hired an Irish criminal named Vincent Call to carry out the job. Maranzano had reportedly asked Lucky, Genovese, and Costello to come to his office at the Helmsley Building in Manhattan, intending to have them dealt with either during or immediately after that meeting. Lucky moved first. On September 10, 1931, just 5 months after Masseria was eliminated at that Coney Island restaurant, Lucky sent 4 men to Maranzano's office. The men were Jewish gangsters secured through Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, deliberately chosen because their faces were unknown to Maranzano's crew. They arrived at the office at 230 Park Avenue and presented themselves as law enforcement agents conducting a raid. Maranzano's bodyguards, confronted with what appeared to be official authority, stood down. The men entered Maranzano's private office. Maranzano was attacked and eliminated. He was the boss of all bosses. He had held the title for approximately 5 months. Vincent Call, the man Maranzano had hired to deal with Lucky, arrived at the building shortly after. He was paid off and sent away. Maranzano's murder has never been officially solved. What followed in the days after Maranzano's elimination has sometimes been called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers, a reference to a historical massacre in 13th century Sicily. The claim, repeated in various accounts, is that Lucky used the moment to orchestrate a nationwide sweep that removed dozens of old-world mustache Pete bosses simultaneously, clearing out an entire generation of leadership in one coordinated operation. Historians have since cast doubt on how organized or extensive that purge actually was. The mob killings that did occur in that period were real, but the idea of a perfectly synchronized national operation has been questioned by serious researchers who looked at the actual documented incidents. What is not in doubt is that the overall effect was the same. The old guard was gone, and the men who replaced them were younger, more American, and aligned with Lucky's vision. Lucky was now, by any practical measure, the most powerful organized crime figure in the United States. He had eliminated the 2 men above him, done it without leaving any legal exposure, and positioned himself at the center of everything that came next. He was 34 years old. He chose not to take Maranzano's title. He abolished the position of boss of all bosses entirely, arguing that the title was the problem. It created a target and gave everyone beneath it a reason to scheme. Instead, he proposed something new. A governing body, a structure where the major families would have representation and decisions would be made collectively, reducing the incentive for any one person to make a move against any other. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Lucky built next was not just a criminal organization, it was a system designed to outlast any single individual, including himself. And understanding how that system worked explains why its effects are still visible today. Section 5. Building the Corporation, the Commission, and the 5 Families. By the fall of 1931, Lucky Luciano had done something no one in American organized crime had managed before him. He had cleared out the old leadership, survived the political fallout of doing so, and positioned himself at the center of a criminal world that was waiting to be reorganized. The question was, what came next? Lucky already had the answer. He had been thinking about it for years. The problem with how organized crime had operated up to that point was structural. Everything ran through one person at the top. That person held absolute authority, which meant that every other ambitious person beneath them had a permanent incentive to remove them. The Castellammarese War was the direct result of that system, two men fighting to the finish because the rules said only one could win. Lucky's solution was to eliminate the winner-take-all dynamic entirely. He proposed a commission, a governing body made up of the leaders of the major crime families, where decisions affecting everyone would be made collectively rather than handed down from a single boss. The commission would adjudicate disputes between families, approve major decisions, and maintain a level of order that prevented the kind of open warfare that had just torn New York apart for 2 years. No single person would hold absolute authority. No one would be able to declare themselves boss of all bosses, because that title no longer existed. Later in 1931, Lucky called a meeting in Chicago with bosses from around the country to present this idea. The men in that room represented criminal operations across New York, Chicago, and other major cities. They agreed to the structure. The commission, as it came to be known, was born. The New York operation was organized into 5 families. Each family had its own boss, underboss, and capos who managed crews of soldiers operating across defined territories and criminal enterprises. The 5 families that took shape in this period, which would eventually carry the names Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, were the direct product of Lucky's reorganization. He assigned himself the leadership of what was known as the Luciano family, which would later be renamed the Genovese family after his eventual successor took over. Beyond New York, Lucky helped extend the commission structure to 24 crime families operating across the country. Each of those families controlled their own territory and their own operations, but they were all connected to the same governing framework. It was, as Meyer Lansky famously described it, bigger than United States steel. What made the structure genuinely revolutionary was the inclusion of non-Italian figures in positions of real influence. The old Mustache Pete bosses had refused to work with anyone outside their ethnic group, which meant they were leaving enormous amounts of money and talent on the table. Lucky had grown up on the Lower East Side alongside Jewish and Irish kids. He had built his most trusted relationships across ethnic lines. Lansky was his closest financial advisor. Bugsy Siegel was one of his most reliable operators. Lucky saw no logical reason to exclude people who were useful, and the commission structure reflected that. The criminal empire he now oversaw was not built around any single racket. It covered illegal gambling, which was by far the largest and most consistent revenue stream. It covered loan sharking, lending money at extremely high interest rates to people who could not access legitimate credit, then collecting with the threat of consequences behind every payment. It covered labor union operations, which gave the families enormous leverage over industries like construction, garment manufacturing, garbage collection, and the Manhattan waterfront. The Longshoremen's Union was effectively under mob influence, which meant the families had a hand in controlling what moved in and out of one of the busiest ports in the world. Lucky himself operated from the Waldorf Towers, the residential section of the famous Waldorf Astoria Hotel on Park Avenue. He registered under the name Charles Ross. He dressed in expensive suits, ate at the best restaurants, and moved through Manhattan's social and political circles as a figure of wealth and influence. Politicians knew him, police officials knew him. He had cultivated those relationships carefully over years, and they gave him a layer of protection that money alone could not buy. From that suite in the Waldorf Towers, he directed an operation that had a management structure any legitimate corporation would have recognized. Frank Costello handled gambling and political connections. Other trusted lieutenants managed specific industries and territories. Each layer of the organization had defined responsibilities and reported upward through the chain. Lucky sat at the top. but he was deliberately insulated from the day-to-day operations that could create legal exposure. Between 1925 and his eventual arrest in 1936, Lucky's personal income from his various operations was estimated at around $10 million per year. He reported approximately $22,000 annually to tax authorities. The gap between those two numbers would eventually become one of the tools used against him in court. The commission structure Lucky built proved durable in ways that even he probably did not fully anticipate. When he was eventually imprisoned and later deported, the organization he had created continued functioning. When individual bosses were arrested, convicted, or eliminated, the structure absorbed those losses and kept operating. The families continued. The commission continued. The system Lucky designed in 1931 was still influencing organized crime in America decades after his death. The FBI would later describe Lucky as the man who organized crime in the United States. That description was not an exaggeration. What he built was not a gang, it was an institution. But the same visibility that came with running an institution on that scale also made him a target. While Lucky was living at the Waldorf and running his empire, a young and extremely ambitious prosecutor in New York had taken notice. Thomas Dewey had looked at everything Lucky had built and decided that taking him down would be the defining case of his career. What Dewey did next would send Lucky to the coldest, most remote prison in the state of New York. Section 6. Dewey comes for him. The prosecution of 1936. Thomas Dewey was 33 years old when New York Governor Herbert Lehman appointed him as a special prosecutor to go after organized crime in the city in June 1935. He was young, relentlessly ambitious, and completely unbothered by the fact that the people he was targeting were among the most dangerous and well-connected figures in the country. Dewey had already built a reputation as someone who did not back down, and he had decided early on that Lucky Luciano was his primary objective. Not because running illegal establishments was Lucky's biggest operation, it was not, but because it was the area where Dewey believed he could actually build a case that would hold up in court. Lucky's organization had, during the early 1930s, moved into taking control of illegal establishments across New York City. The operation was known internally as the bonding combination. It worked by pressuring independent operators to pay into a central fund managed by Lucky's people, and those who refused faced consequences that made compliance the obviously safer choice. By the time Dewey began building his case, estimates put the annual revenue from this operation at around $12 million, with approximately 5,000 women working across operations that stretched through New York and into other states. Dewey's assistant, Eunice Carter, was the one who first identified the connection that made the case possible. Carter noticed that women being arrested on vice-related charges across different parts of the city were consistently being represented by the same small group of bondsmen and attorneys. That pattern suggested centralized control. She brought it to Dewey, and he immediately understood what it meant. On February 1st, 1936, at precisely 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, Dewey executed his first major move. 160 uniformed officers, deliberately drawn from outside the NYPD's regular vice squad to prevent any possibility of the operation being leaked to Lucky's people in advance, descended simultaneously on 80 known establishments across Manhattan and Brooklyn. 16 men and 87 women were arrested. Unlike every previous raid of this kind, Dewey did not process and release the arrested individuals. He brought them to his offices, and a judge set bail at $10,000 minimum for each person, a figure far beyond what any of them could pay. That decision was strategic. By holding them, Dewey gave his team time to work on them. Carter had spent months building trust with many of the women involved, and some of them, having been on the receiving end of beatings and intimidation from Lucky's enforcers, were willing to talk if it kept them out of prison. By mid-March 1936, several of those arrested had directly implicated Lucky as the man at the top of the operation. Lucky got word that people were talking. He left New York and headed to Hot Springs, Arkansas, which was at that time a well-known sanctuary for organized crime figures, a resort town where local law enforcement had long-standing arrangements that made it a relatively safe place to wait out problems. He went there with his girlfriend at the time, Gay Orlova, a Broadway dancer, and settled in to let his lawyers handle things from a distance. It did not work out that way. A New York detective named John Brennan happened to be in Hot Springs on a completely unrelated matter when he spotted Lucky walking along Bath House Row on April 1, 1936. Brennan approached him. Lucky declined to go back to New York voluntarily. Dewey's team sought extradition. Lucky's lawyers fought it. The legal battle over extradition lasted more than 2 weeks, eventually requiring 20 Arkansas state troopers to physically remove Lucky from the protection of the local Hot Springs sheriff and put him on a train back to New York. When he arrived, Judge Philip McCook set his bail at $350,000, the equivalent of roughly $6 million today. Lucky's trial began on May 13, 1936. The prosecution's star witness was a woman named Florence Brown, known as Cokie Flo, who testified that she had overheard conversations in which Lucky discussed his plans for the operation. 27 other women also took the stand over the course of the trial, each offering their own account of how the operation ran and who was ultimately in charge of it. The defense challenged the credibility of these witnesses aggressively, pointing out that several of them were in legal trouble of their own and had obvious incentive to say whatever the prosecution needed them to say. Lucky made the decision to take the stand himself. It was, by nearly every assessment, a catastrophic mistake. When he was cross-examined by Dewey, he was unable to explain how he maintained a lifestyle of obvious wealth: penthouse hotels, expensive suits, a chauffeur-driven car, on a reported annual income of $22,000. Dewey used phone records to demonstrate that Lucky had been in regular contact with known criminals, including Louis Lepke Buchalter and Ciro Terranova. Lucky's denials under questioning came across as dishonest, and Dewey pressed him on every inconsistency in his testimony until the picture of Lucky as a man living a double life was impossible to ignore. On June 7, 1936, the jury returned its verdict. Lucky Luciano was found guilty on 62 counts of compulsory-related offenses. On June 18th, Judge McCook sentenced him to 30 to 50 years in state prison. It was the longest sentence ever handed down in the United States for that category of offense. McCook addressed Lucky directly before delivering the sentence, telling him that the crimes of which he stood convicted made him responsible for every harmful act committed by everyone connected to the operation. Lucky was first sent to Sing Sing, then transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, a remote maximum security prison near the Canadian border that inmates called Little Siberia, because of both its geographical isolation and its brutal winters. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. He was the most powerful organized crime figure in the country, and he was now locked in a cell at the edge of the map. What almost no one outside a very small circle knew at that point was that the war currently tearing Europe apart would eventually give Lucky a way out. Section 7. Running the Mob from Prison. Boss behind bars. Clinton Correctional Facility sat near the Canadian border in a town called Dannemora, New York. Inmates had been calling it Little Siberia for decades, and the name was not an exaggeration. The winters were severe, the location was remote, and the facility had been designed specifically to house the most difficult prisoners in the New York state system. When Lucky Luciano arrived there in the summer of 1936, he was carrying a 30 to 50-year sentence and had just watched every appeal his lawyers filed get rejected one after another. By any normal measure, his story should have ended there. It did not. And the reason it did not tells you more about the organization Lucky had built than almost anything else in his entire career. The first thing that became clear in the months following his conviction was that sending Lucky to prison had not actually removed him from power. He had designed the commission and the family structure specifically so that no single arrest, not even his own, could bring the whole thing down. Frank Costello, who had been one of Lucky's closest associates for years, stepped into the role of managing day-to-day operations almost immediately. Costello was known in New York circles as the Prime Minister, a nickname that reflected both his political connections and his preference for resolving problems through negotiation rather than force. He was exactly the kind of steady, low-drama manager that the organization needed while its actual boss was behind bars. When Lucky's appeals finally ran out in 1938, Costello formally assumed the position of acting boss of the commission. But the critical point is what that transition demonstrated. The structure held. The families kept operating. The revenue kept flowing. The political connections Costello had cultivated continued to function. Lucky had built something that did not depend on his physical presence to keep running, and prison proved it. What Lucky retained from his cell was influence. Not the kind that requires being in the room, but the deeper kind that comes from being the person who built the room in the first place. His opinion still mattered to the men running things on the outside. His approval was still sought on significant decisions. Visitors came to see him, and the conversations that happened during those visits shaped what the organization did when those visitors walked back out. His conditions inside Dannemora were notably better than those of the average inmate. He had a personal chef preparing his meals. He received visitors with a regularity and a level of access that the standard prison environment did not typically permit. These were not accidents. They reflected both Lucky's continuing influence and the organizational capacity of the people on the outside to make arrangements that worked in his favor. Prison officials were not immune to the same pressures and incentives that had shaped law enforcement and political figures in New York for decades. In May 1942, Lucky was transferred from Dannemora to Great Meadow Correctional Facility, a less harsh environment located in Comstock, New York. The transfer was connected to his agreement to cooperate with the United States Navy, which will be covered in the next section, but its practical effect was significant. Great Meadow was considerably more comfortable than Little Siberia, and Lucky's conditions improved substantially as a result. His ability to receive visitors and communicate with his associates on the outside became considerably easier. The question of how much operational control Lucky actually retained during his imprisonment is one that historians and organized crime researchers have looked at carefully. The honest answer is that it was substantial in the early years and gradually diminished over time, which is exactly what you would expect. The further he got from the moment of his conviction, the more the men running things on the outside developed their own authority and their own ways of doing things. Costello built his own relationships, his own political network, his own way of managing the commission. By the mid-1940s, Costello was not simply holding Lucky's seat warm, he was running things. But Lucky's strategic value to the organization never fully disappeared, even from prison. He was the founder. He was the one who had designed the structure that made everything work. When significant disputes arose, his perspective carried weight in a way that no one else's could, simply because everyone in the organization understood that the framework they were all operating within had come from his mind. There is also the matter of what Lucky represented to the men working within the families. He had built something that was supposed to be bigger than any one person, and his own imprisonment was proving that the design worked. The boss was in prison, and the organization was still functioning. That was not a failure of the system. That was the system working exactly as intended. For the soldiers and capos and bosses operating across New York and beyond, watching the structure survive Lucky's absence was its own kind of proof that what they were part of was genuinely durable. By 1942, Lucky had been in prison for 6 years. He was in his mid-40s. The 30 to 50-year sentence meant that even with good behavior and the most favorable possible parole timeline, he was looking at many more years before any legitimate path to release presented itself. His lawyers had tried every legal avenue and found nothing that worked. What changed everything had nothing to do with the courts. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the Second World War, and within months, the U.S. Navy found itself with a problem on the New York waterfront that no amount of official authority seemed capable of solving. A problem that led military intelligence officers to the conclusion that the only person who could actually help them was sitting in a cell in upstate New York. What happened next was one of the strangest arrangements in American military history, and it bought Lucky Luciano his freedom. Section 8. Operation Underworld. The government made a deal with the devil. In the first 3 months after the United States entered the Second World War, German submarines sank 120 American merchant ships along the East Coast. The losses were staggering, and the threat to supply lines was real. Then, on February 9, 1942, the SS Normandy, a massive French ocean liner that was being converted into an American troop transport ship at a pier in New York Harbor, caught fire and capsized into the Hudson River. The ship rolled onto its side and became a total loss. The Navy could not definitively explain what had happened. The official investigation found no evidence of deliberate action, but in the atmosphere of wartime fear and suspicion, a significant number of people inside the military believed it was not an accident. The incident sent a wave of anxiety through the Office of Naval Intelligence. New York Harbor was one of the most strategically important ports in the world during wartime. Everything moving to support American forces in Europe passed through it. Men, equipment, supplies, ammunition. The docks were controlled almost entirely by the Longshoremen's Union, and the Longshoremen's Union was, in practical terms, under the influence of organized crime. The Navy had assigned more than 100 agents to investigate potential threats on the waterfront. They had gotten essentially nowhere. The dock workers and fishermen in the Italian-American communities that dominated that world were completely closed to strangers, and government agents were the definition of strangers. Commander Charles Haffenden, the naval intelligence officer leading the waterfront security effort, reached the conclusion that official channels were not going to solve this problem. He needed someone the waterfront actually listened to. His team approached a mid-level organized crime figure named Joseph Lanza, who had influence over the Fulton Fish Market and some of the East Side docks. Lanza was cooperative, but he quickly identified the limit of his own reach. Securing the full waterfront, including the Brooklyn docks controlled by Albert Anastasia's people, and the West Side piers where Irish organized crime figures held sway, required someone with authority across all of those worlds simultaneously. According to Lanza, there was only one person who could do that: Lucky Luciano, currently serving his sentence in Dannemora prison near the Canadian border. Haffenden's team went through Lucky's attorney, Moses Polikoff, who in turn reached out to Meyer Lansky. Lansky was the connection point, someone who had Lucky's complete trust and who could make the initial approach without it immediately being dismissed. Lansky traveled to Dannemora to present the proposal to Lucky directly. By one account, when Lansky arrived at the prison, Lucky's first reaction was genuine surprise. He reportedly had no idea why Lansky was there. Lansky explained the situation. The Navy wanted Lucky's help securing the waterfront. In exchange, Lucky would be moved to a more comfortable facility where he could meet more easily with the people he needed to communicate with. There was no explicit promise of early release made at the outset, though Lucky clearly understood that cooperating with the government in wartime created a circumstance that might eventually work in his favor. Lucky agreed. On May 12, 1942, He was transferred from Dannemora to Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock, New York, a considerably less severe environment. The transfer was officially logged as routine. The real reason was known only to a small circle of military and government officials. What followed was a series of meetings at Great Meadow between Lucky, his attorneys, Lansky, and naval intelligence officers. Lucky used his influence to send word through the organizational structure that the waterfront was to be secured, that any suspicious activity was to be reported, and that cooperation with the Navy's security efforts was expected. The strikes and labor disruptions that had been complicating waterfront operations largely stopped. Intelligence about suspicious individuals and activities began flowing to Haffenden's team through organized crime channels. The Navy also sought Lucky's help in preparation for the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943. Lucky's people had contacts in Sicily, family connections, old relationships, the kind of local knowledge that military planners could not develop quickly through official intelligence channels. Naval intelligence officers in New York spent months interviewing Sicilian-born individuals connected to the network, gathering information about harbor layouts, coastlines, and local conditions. Maps were developed. Points of contact on the island were identified. Whether Lucky's direct involvement was decisive to the success of the Sicily invasion has been argued about ever since, with serious historians landing in different places on the question. What is documented, and not seriously disputed, is that the waterfront cooperation was real and that it produced results. What is also documented is that the value of Lucky's contribution was assessed very differently by different people within the government. In 1947, the naval intelligence officer who had been most directly involved in running the operation stated that the actual value of the intelligence Luciano provided had been limited. A 2,600-page report commissioned by Governor Dewey in 1954, conducted by the state's Commissioner of Investigation, William Herlins, reached the opposite conclusion, finding substantial evidence of genuine and valuable cooperation. Naval officials reviewed that report and then asked Dewey not to release it publicly, arguing that it would create a damaging public relations situation for the Navy and might compromise the possibility of similar arrangements in the future. Dewey agreed to suppress it. The report was not made public until after his death in the mid-1970s. On January 3, 1946, Governor Dewey, the same man who had prosecuted Lucky a decade earlier and sent him to prison, signed off on a commutation of Lucky's sentence. Lucky had served 9.5 years of his 30 to 50-year term. The commutation came with a condition. Lucky would not be pardoned. He would be released, but he would be deported to Italy, and he would never be permitted to return to the United States. Lucky accepted the deal. On February 9, 1946, he was released from Great Meadow and placed on a ship bound for Italy. There was a farewell party on the vessel before it departed. Hundreds of people came to see him off. The man who had built the most sophisticated organized crime structure in American history was now being sent back to the country he had left as a 9-year-old boy. But Lucky Luciano had never once in his life accepted a situation as permanent when there was any possibility of changing it. He was already thinking about his next move before the ship left the harbor. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That next move would bring every major organized crime figure in America to a hotel in Havana, Cuba, for one of the most significant criminal gatherings ever held. Section 9. The Havana Conference. The exiled king tries to come home. When Lucky Luciano arrived in Italy in February 1946, he was 48 years old, had spent 9.5 years in prison, and had just been handed a deportation order that was supposed to keep him permanently separated from the criminal empire he had built. The Italian government settled him initially in his birth town of Lercara Fridi in Sicily. Then he moved to Palermo, then Naples, then Rome. Italian police pushed him out of Rome. He ended up back in Naples, living reasonably well but under constant surveillance and with no realistic path to getting back to the United States through any official channel. So he found an unofficial one. By the fall of 1946, Lucky had been in contact with associates in America and had been quietly laying the groundwork for something that would have been impossible if he had simply stayed where the Italian government had put him. In late September 1946, he obtained 2 Italian passports issued in his real name, Salvatore Lucania, with visas for Mexico, Cuba, and several South American nations. Then he began moving. The route he took was deliberately complicated. He left Italy by freighter and traveled to Caracas, Venezuela. From there, he flew to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, then to Mexico City, then back to Caracas, then a private plane to Camagüey in Cuba. He arrived in Havana on October 29, 1946. The circuitous path was designed to make it as difficult as possible for anyone tracking his movements to follow the thread from Italy to Cuba without significant delay. Meyer Lansky met him when he arrived. Lansky had been the operational architect of the plan and had already arranged for Lucky to move into an estate in the Miramar section of Havana. Cuba at that time was under the government of Fulgencio Batista, who had a well-documented willingness to accommodate the interests of American organized crime in exchange for financial arrangements that worked in his favor. Lansky had already brokered a deal that involved a significant investment in Cuban casino and hotel operations, with a portion of the proceeds flowing back to Batista. Lucky purchased a $150,000 stake in the Hotel Nacional, one of the most prominent properties in Havana. The financial relationship between the American mob and the Cuban government was, at that point, firmly established. Lucky's stated ambition was to use Cuba as a base from which to reassert control over American operations and eventually find a way back into the country itself. Cuba was 90 miles from Florida. Being there was categorically different from being in Naples. He could meet with American associates without the same logistical complications, communicate more easily, and position himself as a functioning presence in the organization rather than a distant figurehead. In early December 1946, a sealed envelope had reached Lucky months earlier from a recently deported American mob figure. It contained 3 words: December, Hotel Nacional. That was the signal for what Lansky had been organizing on Lucky's behalf. A gathering of the most significant organized crime figures in the United States, convened in Havana to formally acknowledge Lucky's continued authority and to address the major business questions facing the organization in the post-war period. The Havana Conference convened on December 20th, 1946, at the Hotel Nacional. The delegations that arrived represented New York City, New Jersey, Buffalo, Chicago, New Orleans, and Florida. The largest group came from the New York and New Jersey area. Senior figures from the Jewish syndicate were also present to discuss joint business interests. The roster of attendees included Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, and Santo Trafficante, among others. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary concentration of criminal power in a single location. To mark Lucky's return and acknowledge his authority, every person who attended the conference brought him a cash envelope as a gift. Those envelopes, collectively, contained more than $200,000. At the first night dinner, hosted by Costello, Lansky, and Adonis, the money was presented to Lucky directly. Frank Sinatra was also in Havana during the conference. He had flown there with Joseph Fischetti, a cousin of Al Capone, who acted as his escort. Sinatra performed during the gathering, providing a public cover story for the concentration of visitors, a celebrity entertainment event rather than a criminal summit. Sinatra brought with him a suitcase that, according to multiple accounts, contained $2 million in cash for Lucky, representing his share of ongoing American operations. The agenda of the conference covered several significant areas. The leadership situation within the New York families was discussed, particularly the position of Vito Genovese, who had returned from his own period in Italy and was making clear that he wanted considerably more authority than he currently held. Lucky shut that conversation down directly. When Genovese suggested that Lucky take a purely ceremonial role and let Genovese run things operationally, Lucky's response was unambiguous. He told Genovese that there was no boss of all bosses, that he had turned that title down himself in front of everyone, and that if he ever changed his mind about taking it, it would not be Genovese's decision to make. Genovese was told to continue working within the existing structure. The conference also addressed the situation with Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who had been given mob financing to build the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, and had massively exceeded his budget, while also failing to deliver the returns that had been promised. The figures discussed at the conference regarding the Flamingo's cost overruns were significant enough that serious consequences for Siegel were considered. Siegel was eliminated in June 1947, several months after the conference ended. Whether the decision was formally made in Havana or came later has been a matter of historical debate, but the groundwork for what happened to him was laid during those meetings. What ended the Havana conference was not the completion of its agenda. It was the intervention of Harry Anslinger, the head of the United States Bureau of Narcotics, who had been tracking Lucky's movements and understood exactly what his presence in Cuba represented. Anslinger went first to the State Department to pressure Cuba into removing Lucky. The Cuban government initially declined. Anslinger then went directly to President Harry Truman. On February 21, 1947, Anslinger formally notified the Cuban government that the United States would immediately block all shipments of American pharmaceutical products to Cuba for as long as Lucky remained on the island. The threat of cutting off medicine to an entire country was enough. 2 days later, Cuba announced that Lucky was in custody and would be deported to Italy within 48 hours. He was put on a Turkish freighter headed for Genoa. When the ship docked in Italy on April 11, 1947, Italian police were waiting on the pier. They arrested him immediately and sent him to a jail in Palermo. The closest Lucky had gotten to America since his deportation had lasted less than 6 months, and it had ended with him back in an Italian cell. The dream of returning home was effectively finished. But Lucky Luciano did not stop operating just because geography and 2 governments were working against him. What he did in the years that followed from his base in Naples would keep law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic occupied right up until the moment he took his last breath. Section 10. Exile, Surveillance, and the Charges Waiting at the Airport when he passed away. When Lucky Luciano arrived back in Italy in April 1947 after being expelled from Cuba, Italian police arrested him at the Genoa docks and sent him to a jail in Palermo. He was held briefly and then released without formal charges being filed. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define the last 15 years of his life, a cycle of arrests, interrogations, surveillance, suspicion, and releases, with law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic convinced he was running significant criminal operations from his apartment in Naples, but unable to produce the evidence needed to make anything stick in court. He eventually settled permanently in Naples, in a comfortable apartment that became both his home and, effectively, his office. Italian police monitored him constantly. American narcotics agents tracked his movements and his contacts. Despite all of that attention, Lucky continued meeting with associates, entertaining visitors, and maintaining the kind of social presence that made it obvious he had not retired. He frequented restaurants, met with American tourists and sailors, and conducted himself in public as a man of leisure and influence rather than someone in hiding. In early July 1949, Rome police arrested him on suspicion of involvement in shipping narcotics to New York. After a week in custody, they released him without filing charges. They also permanently banned him from the city of Rome, which effectively confined his movements to Naples and its surrounding area for the rest of his life. In June 1951, Naples police brought him in for questioning after receiving intelligence that he had illegally brought $57,000 in cash and a new American car into Italy. After 20 hours of questioning, he was released again without charges. In 1952, the Italian government revoked his passport entirely, responding to pressure from American and Canadian law enforcement officials who wanted his movement restricted. Without a valid passport, his ability to travel internationally was eliminated. The man who had moved across multiple continents in 1946 to orchestrate the Havana Conference was now confined to a single city, watched around the clock, unable to leave without government permission. In November 1954, an Italian judicial commission in Naples formally imposed structured restrictions on him. He was required to report to the police every Sunday without exception. He was required to be home every night. He could not leave Naples without specific permission from the authorities. The commission cited his alleged involvement in narcotics trafficking as the basis for these conditions. Lucky publicly denied the narcotics accusations, as he had denied them throughout his entire career. He had denied them even when he was running heroin deliveries through hat bands as a teenager in Manhattan. The narcotics question is one that serious researchers have examined carefully without reaching a clean conclusion. What is established is that Lucky attended a meeting in Palermo in 1957 with Italian and American organized crime figures, where the agenda included coordinating a major push into narcotics distribution in the United States, specifically targeting working-class communities in American cities. The plan involved Italian crime figures who did not have American criminal records and could therefore move more freely, operating in American family territories, and paying a form of rent to the families who controlled those territories in exchange for permission to operate. Lucky was present at that meeting. His direct operational role versus his advisory or approval role has never been definitively established. What Italian authorities were prepared to state, based on years of investigation, was that by the end of his life, they believed Lucky had been involved in moving approximately $150 million worth of narcotics into the United States over roughly a 10-year period. That figure represents what prosecutors were ready to charge him with at the time of his passing. The charges were never filed, for a reason that no one could have predicted. During these years, Lucky also experienced the most significant personal relationship of his later life. In early 1948, he met Igea Lissoni, an Italian nightclub dancer who was 20 years younger than him. She moved in with him later that year. Lucky described her as the love of his life. Their relationship lasted over a decade, though it was not without difficulty. Lucky continued having affairs with other women throughout the relationship, which led to serious arguments between them. By some accounts, he was physically aggressive with her during those arguments on multiple occasions. Lissoni developed breast cancer and passed away in 1959. Lucky never married anyone. He never had children. He had once explained his reasoning by saying he did not want any son of his to go through life carrying the Luciano name. By 1961, Lucky had been approached multiple times about authorizing a film based on his life. He had consistently refused, not wanting to generate content that would antagonize other organized crime figures or invite additional law enforcement scrutiny. After Lissoni's passing, his resistance softened. He began conversations with an American film and television producer named Martin Gosch about the possibility of a biographical project. On January 26, 1962, Lucky drove to Capodichino Airport in Naples to meet Gosch in person. The meeting took place at the airport. After it concluded, Lucky suffered a heart attack. He was 64 years old. He passed away at the airport before medical help could make any difference. What Lucky did not know when he walked into that airport was that Italian narcotics agents had followed him there. They were waiting for the meeting with Gosch to conclude so they could arrest him on the drug smuggling charges that had been building for years. He passed away before they could make their move. The arrest warrant that had his name on it was never served. 3 days after his passing, 300 people attended a funeral service in Naples. His body was transported through the streets of the city in a horse-drawn carriage. With permission from the United States government, his family brought his remains back to New York. More than 2,000 people attended his funeral at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. He was buried there under his birth name, Salvatore Lucania, the same name his parents had given him in a small Sicilian mining town 64 years earlier. The criminal structure he built in 1931 did not pass away with him. The 5 families he created are still operating today. The Genovese family, which bears the name of the man who took over after Lucky's deportation, remains one of the most powerful organized crime organizations in the United States. The commission Lucky designed as a governing body for American organized crime continued functioning for decades after his passing. Federal prosecutors in 1985 used the existence of the commission itself as the basis for convicting the bosses of all 5 New York families simultaneously in what became known as the Commission Trial, a legal case built entirely around dismantling the governing structure that Lucky Luciano had created more than 50 years earlier. He never held an official title. He never claimed to be the boss of all bosses. He built a system that was specifically designed so that no single person, including himself, could be indispensable to it. And in doing so, he created something that outlasted him by decades and that law enforcement is still working to dismantle today. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.